Welcome to Enemies from War to Wisdom. Why do we need enemies? From intimate relationships to politics, tribalism, and community, we cannot seem to stop dehumanizing each other. Chronic conflicts in our families, societies, and nations seem inevitable. In this podcast, we analyze human hostilities from the most mundane to the most sophisticated. We apply psychology, psychoanalysis, art, spirituality, and relational theory in conversation about belonging and otherness. Each program will reach for a fresh wisdom that shows us how to step back from creating enemies in our lives. I'm your host, Eleanor Johnson, a videographer and artist with Emma Troupe, an experimental theater group in New York City, and I am here with my co-host, Polly Young-Eisendrath, who is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, author, and speaker. We approach our ideas each from our own worlds, but always from the spirit and teaching of Buddhism, of which we are lifelong practitioners. War is unnecessary. In this final episode, Eleanor and Polly look back over their time together in doing the podcast, and they assess where humanity seems to be standing in regard to war and wisdom. They reflect on the state of war and why humans return repeatedly to armed polarization called war. And they talk about other options for polarization. For example, being able to talk about our differences in a humanized way. Why is that still apparently unachievable? And how does humane dialogue relate to mindfulness? Why are we stuck still in hostile enactments with other humans? In this final meeting, these two friends use humor and spiritual insight to look at where we are standing and how hard it is to travel, even in our own minds, from war to wisdom. Hello, I'm Eleanor. And welcome, Polly. I'm here in the Pacific Northwest and you're in Vermont, so we're on two sides of the country. Very, very special to be here. And we have a backdrop in our world today with actual war.
Yes. Well, Eleanor, I wanted to say first that our friendship has survived all of the distance and what we've been each doing in our own worlds. But today we're here from Vermont and Seattle, the Seattle area, I guess.
Yes.
And to talk about this idea of the journey from war to wisdom, and the fact at the end of this, these wonderful episodes that we've had together on this podcast, where we've had so many good conversations, but at the very end, I'm faced with this feeling of defeat. Here we are in a worse war than I can recall in my entire lifetime, with a kind of genocidal assault on a group of people that are trapped. And I understand that the other side also was assaulted and that they are fighting for what they consider to be their survival. But on a larger, sort of view, I am sure that humans cannot survive with war as their way of handling conflict, that there is no way to stop war without outlawing it, because we humans apparently have this tremendous desire to kill people that we don't agree with. And it seems as though it's very difficult for us to draw on our wisdom. So, it's in some ways to me very, very ironic and sad that you and I are having our final episode during war.
Right. And I also think on another level, Polly, being that I've spent my life wrestling with these questions of war and peace, that perhaps now we're pulling things up from the root, from such a deep, deep place, that possibly there's a way that we can begin to end war now. We're at a place where if we don't do that, we may not have, a civilization, humanity may not be here. But anyway, I'm very hopeful. I'm very, very aware. I'm present, but I'm also very hopeful. But, Polly, I wanted to ask you, because there's so much teaching in the podcast that we've been doing, and that you have laid such a groundwork over time with all of our conversations in terms of ways that we can begin to develop awareness, to be able to work with polarization and to end the kind of struggle that we all are facing with situations where we're, humiliated, or we have rage, or we're wounded, or we're traumatized. But I'd like to start with asking you if you could just talk a little bit more with us about why you think it's still so unachievable to stop using violence and killing as a means toward peace.
Well, I think that I have had to conclude, first of all, that peace is unachievable for humans. I think that what is achievable is being able to speak about our polarization.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that as humans, we have such a variety of ways of understanding truth, of understanding our situation, of also, we all have the desire to protect ourselves, our families, what we cherish. And there are some big and I think really unreconcilable differences in the way that humans understand good and bad and right and wrong, and also what it takes to survive and how, what the best ways are for relating to each other. So I would say polarization is going to be with us. The options that we have as humans, and you and I can return to this, have to do with using speech, because we have this capacity not only to speak to each other, but to speak to ourselves, to work things out in our own thoughts, so that we can, with reflection, examine what is going on in a situation. We can turn from what you could call the limbic system reactivity that all mammals have, the fight and flight, fight and flight and freeze. We can turn from that towards this ability to reflect, to mentalize, to see what is going on. And we can stop ourselves from acting. I think from the beginning of the podcast, we talked about that humans can stop themselves right in the middle of an action and reflect and say, do I really want to do this? What are the consequences of this? So this ability to speak, this ability to think in speech, to examine our own thoughts and feelings, all of this is available to us. At this point in our history, when so many people have now the small device that we call a cell phone that allows them to see what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Israel, there is more, let's say, knowledge of what war looks like, of what killing looks like. There's more knowledge of what genocide is than there was even in the Vietnam War, because we didn't have these kinds of access that we have now through our devices. So why is it that we can't seem to stop killing? I think there are two big reasons. One is that humans, Homo sapiens, have a passion for killing. Mm-hmm. And if you look back in our history, we started killing in large numbers even when we were hunter-gatherers. We were driving large numbers of bison or elephants or other humans into these sharp ravines. And once they were pushed over the side, they were dead in large numbers, and we could go in and hunt or take what we wanted. And I've come to understand, both from Noah Yuval Harari and also from other anthropologists, that this massive killing that early Homo sapiens did was increased very much by agricultural societies, where people started then, the Homo sapiens started to amass surplus wealth, like crops and so on, that they had to protect then. And so we have this passion about killing. There's a kind of belief that seems to be very deeply within our species that we can protect ourselves by killing others. And so that in itself has to be seen and understood as a fact of the matter. This is the kind of being we are. And then secondly, and this is where real dialogue and the things that I'm working on come in, we have to be aware that as humans, we have options that other mammals don't have. And so we can stop ourselves. We can examine what we're doing. We can understand the difference between death and killing. There's a difference. And we can begin to see that killing, in the end, doesn't really protect us, because it always leads to more killing. So war becomes everlasting because the passion to kill leads to killing, and the killing leads to the other side taking vengeance. And then that becomes repetitive. And you could say that the conflict that's going on now in Gaza between Hamas and Israel, or you could say it from this way, between Israeli people and Palestinian people, that conflict is the further development of what we call World War II. And so it's been in one iteration or another, from World War II to the Cold War, to the Korean War, to then Kuwait, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now here. And there's been an everlasting quality because of the vengeance. And so when humans can understand that deeply, they can see that the killing is not in their favor, that it doesn't really protect. But on a very immediate level, I believe Homo sapiens have had a passion for killing, instead of using words from our beginnings. And then that passion increased when wealth became an issue, the amassing of wealth that then people have to protect. And that amassing of wealth then led to essentially, for the United States, for our country, the investment of business in weaponry. And now the amassing of wealth around the weapons that are made by the US, further increases our desire to use the weapons, because we then have to protect the stock market, the assets, and so on that are invested in the weapon industry. And the whole thing becomes a kind of snowball. So I gave a whole long answer there, but the two things I think are, number one, the passion for killing. And number two, our inability to recognize that our survival is enhanced by not killing.
Exactly.
That really will enhance human survival in space-time, on Earth, in samsara. If we go on with the killing, that really will end human survival here.
Yes, and I'd like to bring in I'd like to say that I think of myself more as a human being than a Homo sapien, and that through most of my life, I have not thought about killing. I have thought the opposite. And I kind of align myself with people who are holding to an understanding that is rooted much more in, you could say, consciousness at one level and also spirituality on another level, in terms of having values that help us wrestle with this more animalistic, primitive side of ourselves, in terms of the Homo sapien and the misuse of power and all the things that lead to this kind of devastation in the world. I mean, I keep thinking, when I was listening to you as well, Polly, and I've often thought about this during our time together, is that, we need re-education. We need to teach new skills. We need to help people understand that there is a possibility to do it in a different way, but it's a skill. But it also has to be rooted in some kind of deeper belief in the possibility of our humanity and the soul of humanity. I thought something you said to me, we were talking yesterday, that really, really struck me, Polly, and I've never thought about this. You said something about a belief is not a person. I thought that was so profoundly insightful, because, so much of what we're talking about is also locked into these beliefs that we'll risk our life for, or we'll kill another for.
Well, if you really deeply know that if you disagree with somebody, it's possible to find out what they're thinking and how they're feeling.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that you have to change your own mind. It only means that you find out why they see what they see. And you don't have to kill anyone because of their beliefs. And so, if you disagree with somebody, are you disagreeing with their belief? Or are you dehumanizing them as a person so that you could kill them? Right. And there's a really big distinction. I can disagree very, very strongly with any number of people, and I do, but I don't dehumanize them.
Right.
I see them still as people like me. They grew up in families. They're trying to make their lives happier. They're trying to protect their children. They have a lot of human qualities, even if I really disagree with them. And, I happen to believe very strongly that humans can become conscious enough to stop this passion of wanting to blame and then wipe out people that have beliefs that are different than our own. I believe we can do that. And furthermore, I believe it only takes about 20% of the 100% to basically change the system and to help us, all recognize that we can do something different than kill. So I was a pacifist, as all of my life. I mean, I would say, I've never been ever ever in favor of killing at all. But it's taken me over a lifetime to realize that speaking to humans about peace is kind of like blah, 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 because, it's like they're not at that level yet, that many humans really need to work on the issue of what do they do when their feelings are activated.
Right. Or when they come to an understanding of what peace means, what peacemaking means. It's like we have to redefine our words because our words have become so empty. People don't know what peace means. They do know what war means because war affects them in a way that is very visible. But peace, what's underneath? What's underneath the dream of peace? What's underneath the longing for peace? I mean, I find that if you really kind of examine that, again, spiritual qualities, they're almost like qualities that stretch you as a Homo sapien, that help you to become a human being. There's a difference, we used to talk about that in the early days,
Well, right. Yes. And you and I often came, down on slightly different sides of that, because I do think that even the people who are so-called atheists or non-believers, or, those people who wouldn't say they embrace the spiritual world, I think they're very capable of doing this same shift, of shifting away from killing and towards negotiation, conversation, dialogue. I don't think that one has to be spiritual. I think that having a spiritual practice is a, let's say, advantage to working hopefully with your own reactivity, with one's own reactivity.
Right.
If you have a spiritual practice, you have some more tools in your toolbox, even if you pray or use a mantra, to stop you from just reacting, from just wanting to blame or just wanting to eliminate your enemy.
We've also used the word mindfulness as a way of bypassing spiritual, because spiritual feels, a lot more charged. People think of spiritual as religious, but, to redeem spirituality as something that's a part of us, rather than something that is separate from us.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it is.
It's bigger than, it's big. Spiritual.
Yes. Well, I mean, I agree with you, but I know there are a lot of people who don't. I mean, I don't want to leave out the, it's like, I personally cannot imagine living here on earth without spiritual practice, because it's such a difficult life. And the main reason why it is so difficult is other human beings, that most of the time, the wild elephants are not coming after me. I'm not at risk for any animals hurting me. I'm not at risk. Even, I mean, weather sometimes is very threatening. We had big floods in Vermont this summer, but most of the time, the only risks I have are from humans. And, and most of those risks, because I'm not in a situation right now that is war, most of those risks have to do with somebody, let's say, maligning me or betraying me, or treating me badly through words. Usually those are the big risks I face, and I can work with those. Risks, but I'm not in a situation of war. I think if I were in a situation of war, I would have to revise all my skills, because I haven't been ever in a war, either as a victim or a perpetrator. I have worked with people, in a counseling service at Norwich University. I supervised the psychology interns there who were working with people who had come back from combat. So I have heard and listened to recordings that show me very deeply what it feels like for people who have come back from combat in war and have killed other people. And that terrible, I would say, guilt and shame and anxiety, the identification with the people they've killed, whether those are children or mothers. This is a lifelong entanglement. And of course, from a Buddhist perspective, it's many lives. It's not just this life, but the entanglement that comes from killing is very deep. So I haven't experienced that myself. So, mostly my entanglements are through words. And I feel that it is possible for humans, because of the ways that we can work with ourselves and our own behaviors. It's possible for us to change, and it's possible for us to govern ourselves, so that we don't react in a way that is deeply harmful. However, I haven't myself ever been in a situation of war where I had to draw on my mindfulness. I'm doing that in a situation of non-war, and it's hard enough.
Right, exactly. Well, that's where we begin.
Yeah.
I remember in the early days in my when I first stepped into my training as a Buddhist, I remember one of the Rinpoches saying, "You don't start to practice meditation when the bombs are dropping.
Yeah.
You do it much, much before."
Right.
But I think when I was using, talking about the spiritual dimension, I was also thinking about the healing journey, that whenever we're locked into any kind of negativity, violence, aggression, hatred, all of that, where's the gateway where we begin the journey toward healing? And if we don't start with ourself and then from self to other, I don't know where we start.
Well, we
I mean,
have to start with our own behaviors.
exactly.
We go back to like some of our other episodes. We all of us come into being inside of another person,
Right.
actually inside of a woman. All of us come into being. We get here only one way. That's kind of something to remember. We get
Right.
here one way only, and that's through another woman. And that time of growing up requires a lot of investment of a lot of people in us. So by the time we're able to practice mindfulness, thousands of beings have invested in us, all of the beings that gave up their lives so we could eat them, all of the beings that have taken care of us, and then their teachers and their nurses and caregivers. So, we all have a lot of investment of many beings. However, and so we're made up of lots and lots of beings. However, we have this ability to govern only one being. That's us.
Exactly.
We only have the responsibility for one, and that responsibility is grave. It's important, and we have to start with our own thoughts and feelings, our reactivity, and decide how we want to conduct ourselves as adults with others, so that we create, what you would be calling peace and what I might call equanimity, so that we can take a step-by-step involvement in our lives without making things worse for ourselves.
And that is the practice, in our dailiness of doing no harm, of
Well,
having
yes.
having that, again, that value, that kind of, where we can hold some kind of witness, even when we collapse into our own, negativity, or we're triggered or whatever, but to have that memory, that willingness, that desire to do no harm.
Well, and the tools, like you said, and so, I mean, through doing this podcast, I hope that people have gotten some tools. We've talked a lot about conflict, about projective identification, about all kinds of hostilities in the family and dependency needs, and how to come out on the wisdom side of all of those things.
Right.
And we've talked about war. You and I we did a number of episodes on
Right.
war.
I think you've laid real track, Polly. I mean, I really honor you in terms of how the building blocks of how you've helped people understand how to transform conflict rather than just fix it or resolve it.
Right.
And again, what the tools are, always looking back at oneself. And I think if because we've got so many, I mean, I went through a lot of the podcasts, I looked at the website and stuff, and it's a wonderful series of teachings. So, just wanting to remind our listeners that they're available, they're online, and it's just, wonderfully helpful for what we're facing now, because everything's accelerated right now, because we're in war, and there's no more invisible war. It's like we're in war right now, and it's a very, very dangerous time for all of us. It's interesting for me. I mean, I've never felt more hopeful, because I've wrestled with these forces all of my life, and I'm at a stage now where, for whatever time I have left on the planet, I'm taking a stand for an embodiment of the values that, have shaped me.
So, I think you and I probably have a different stance in regard to hope. I always,
yes. We talked about that a lot.
A lot. We did. Yes. I mean, I have hope in the things that I'm teaching. I have hope that people respond to them. On a larger scale, I feel quite a lot of despair at the moment because of the, let's say, willingness, apparently, of my government to rush in to support genocide at a moment when I would have much preferred the stepping back, the ceasefire approach, the reflection. And I feel a kind of deep responsibility for responding to my government. And in that way, I am not feeling particularly hopeful about governments, particularly mine in the US.
I don't think it's going to come from that. It's going to come from people in a different way. I mean,
Well,
I
yes.
think it's so, I mean, it's staggering that we've made the choices that we've made. I mean, that was shocking for me.
Mm.
Shocking for me. It traumatized me to realize that we stepped in at that level again.
I know, I know. And,
Yeah.
so I feel sometimes, in the work that I do, which is in the area of real dialogue and dialogue therapy, and I want to spend just a few minutes talking about
I
those
think it's,
tools a
yeah, so
little.
to talk about the new
Yeah.
center that you're starting, because I think, Polly, those again, I mean, for all of us to learn those tools, it's a practice.
Yeah.
And I just think you've done a remarkable job, Polly. And so it would be nice to take what remaining time we have to talk about the center of that you're not for profit.
Yeah, well, I will in just a minute, but I want to acknowledge a couple of things with you that, I'm remembering as you and I are speaking to each other. Both of us are Buddhist practitioners. We're lifelong Buddhist practitioners. So in the deepest way, I have this deep gratitude for the Buddha Dharma, for my teachers. I mean, I know you do too, because without my teachers and without this whole framework of wisdom, I wouldn't be able to even wrestle with the issues of this entangling repetitive conflict, the entangling repetitive hostility that humans show at home, in their in their families, in their societies, and then in the species. So it's really through the Buddha Dharma that I've operated all along, and then I've tried to make that very practical using various wisdoms that come from Carl Jung, from Sigmund Freud, and from a whole bunch of other psychoanalysts. And then some of the wisdoms also that come from other studies of human relationships and development, all of which I have a lifetime of having mentors and teachers, and all of that has gone into my thinking about real dialogue and the development of consciousness through dyadic relationships, through the two-person relationship, like your relationship to me. We have a long time two-person relationship. We've had disagreements, we've had also agreements, we've had fun, we've had play, and together we develop. Without having that mirroring relationship, it's really hard to see the self. The self is kind of, let's say, opaque in a sense that it comes from deep unconsciousness. But each of us, all the same, is responsible for ourselves. And so, I'm kind of meandering into this idea that when you and I started doing this podcast, I know we were sitting on a train.
Right, we were coming from New Haven. That's right.
That's right. And we were thinking about what could we do together in a podcast, and we came up with our logo, and we came up with the title "Enemies from War to Wisdom," which required a lot of argument back and forth and back and forth. And then we had some commentary from our friends, how they didn't like our logo, how they didn't like perhaps the title "Enemies," but we stayed with it. It's really from that beginning that I started to think more clearly about real dialogue, about what is it that I could take from my many years of doing dialogue therapy with couples? How could I take that sense that those two people in their dyadic relationship, they can transform their hatred into curiosity and interest about each other, which increases their intimacy then. Now, and I've seen that thousands of times because I've started working in dialogue therapy in 1984 with my late husband, Ed Epstein. And so how could I make that transformation that I see in the couple something that's accessible to lots of people? And I really think by conversations with you, I started developing more precisely these three components of the skill of real dialogue. And I'll talk about those in a minute, but you and I have 3 podcasts about them too. 47, 48, 49. Recently I have transformed what was called the Institute for Dialogue Therapy into the Center for Real Dialogue. And of course, you were always telling me you've got to do a nonprofit. And
Right.
I was always saying, well, my advisors are telling me, no, we should try to make this for profit because we'll try to sell it, blah, blah, blah. This is the way to support it.
Mhm.
And in the end, I came to see that I have to have a nonprofit because there aren't enough people that really can easily subscribe to buying a skill to help them with conflict. It's like a lot of people think they already know.
And the not-for-profit world, which I've been part of now for over 40 years, is an extraordinary world in terms of being able to bring through the new and innovation in a way that, say, maybe the moneyed world or the corporate world is not so ready to support.
Yeah.
So I congratulate you on stepping into the not-for-profit world.
Well, we're just in the process of getting everything, our T's crossed and our I's dotted, but we do have we have a board of directors. We have our application in. I'm sure we're going to get it approved. We had to go through a bit of a process there, but I have everything really in place, and I think within 2 weeks we'll be operating as a nonprofit. But I can say now that we are the Center for Real Dialogue, and that includes the training in facilitating real dialogue and the training to become a dialogue therapist. It includes both, but the real dialogue training is for people of any sort, from any organization, coaching, leadership, mediation, or just people that are interested in learning to facilitate a conversation. And then on the dialogue therapy side, that has to be mental health professionals who want to learn how to become dialogue therapists. And both dialogue therapy and real dialogue require, first of all, learning the skill of real dialogue, which is a 3-part skill, and then learning how to facilitate other people using that skill when they are in conflict, and particularly when they're in passionate conflict where they really can't seem to get to that space of a play space, of a creative space together, because they're locked in to repetitive conflict, which is very much like war. Like war is opposition where there are two sides and the two sides can't seem to come together, but then they are armed. So that's the difference between war and polarization. It's just war is armed.
Well, the people who have gone in to wrestle with these forces in the field. I mean, when I think of all the men and women who have been working in the Middle East in terms of war and peace and Israeli-Arab conflict and all of that, I mean, to their own, they've tried to find those skills to be able to open up the field for that kind of dialogue. But it'll be wonderful to think that as you train these people, they can then go off into the Middle East. They can go off into these areas. Also, we need more and more people. They've been calling for therapists to make themselves available to help with the issues in the Middle East right now. That's been in the last couple of days, I've come across that quite a bit.
Well, the thing is that this skill that we're calling the skill of real dialogue, it has 3 parts, and most people, when they hear the description, say, "Oh, I know how to do that already."
Right.
But I've now spent so much time.
You've gone deeper.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah, just
deeper.
working with people.
Yeah.
So the first skill is speaking for yourself, and
Yes.
that means that in the way that you're speaking, you're only claiming subjective knowledge. So it's using I statements, not we statements, because we statements are always the royal we. And of course, sometimes I use, of course, we statements because I'm speaking rhetorically or I'm speaking in a general way. But when I say something like we should always be kind, if I'm speaking to another person, the other person might at that moment say, "Don't speak for me." Sometimes I don't want to be kind. So the we always includes speaking for someone else. So when I'm using real dialogue, I speak for myself. No we statements, no you statements, only I statements. Then I'm speaking only from my desires, my thoughts, my feelings, my memories, what it is that I want or that I feel or that I experience. I know that that's limited. I know that that is a limited world. I then need to ask you, well, what do you think? How do you feel? Because if I'm in a dialogue with another person who has a difference, I want to hear that difference because I know that I don't know it. I am only a little itty bitty human being here who only knows what I have in my first person experience actually experienced. And so that right away creates a boundary. Yeah.
And also, I mean, that's a pathway into authenticity. That's a pathway into embodiment. I mean, that's where it starts.
Well, and it's authenticity and embodiment. Again, people say these words, but they require practicing and recognizing mindfully that one is a limited being, and that if I say something like war is bad, I'm making a rhetorical statement. If I say I won't kill, I am making a personal statement. The reason why I have said a number of times, even here, that I haven't been in a war is that I don't know what it's like to be in a war. I know what it's like to kill from having killed, say, for example, a squirrel with my car. I have seen what it was like to kill the squirrel and what the squirrel was like in dying. I have also, killed insects at times. That's about it. But I have had that experience, and then I have heard people talk about killing humans. So again, my knowledge of killing is limited. I also don't believe that war can ever benefit humans, but I realize there are other humans that have different beliefs than I do. So, speaking for myself, speaking subjectively, that is the first principle of the skill. And so speaking for yourself is a skill. It's a mindfulness skill, requires mindfulness, requires modesty, always said with a recognition of, I want to hear what you feel and think. So how about you? And then that leads to the second skill, which is listening. And the listening, of course, is if any one of us listens well, we're able to paraphrase. Then we can say back to the other person, I'm understanding you to say this, or I am making sense of what you're saying in this way. Did I get that? So paraphrasing and then checking, did I get it? And then maybe asking for more. Is there more? Expand your story. Tell me more. I'm curious. So listening mindfully is more than saying, I hear you saying blah, 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 because I hear you saying also assumes that there's a way that I do hear you saying, but actually often people don't hear what the other person's saying. So if I can take responsibility and say, I understand it this way, I'm getting this picture, I'm understanding you to be saying this, did I get it? Then I'm taking responsibility for the fact that my ears might not be open and that I maybe only got a third of what you actually said to me. And maybe in the third I got wasn't even really what you were trying to say. So listening mindfully is very much a mindfulness skill. And then when you put those two skills together, you get the third one, which is remaining curious. If I speak for myself, I listen mindfully, I am curious about you. I'm curious about what's happening for you. I have these beliefs. How about you? I see things this way. How about you? I'm making sense of the data like this. I read the data like this. How do you read the data? So the back and forth of real dialogue opens a world between two people. When those two people disagree, it can be a very interesting new discovery for each person to hear the entire belief of the other side and to recognize it as human, as subjective, as vulnerable, as oneself. Of course it is. It is. And often we don't go so far as to hear the entire argument, belief of the other side. We have instead projections, stereotypes, biases that we apply and we assume we know without going through the dialogue. So again, that skill of real dialogue, three-part skill, speaking for yourself, listening mindfully, remaining curious, is what is applied in helping people in a facilitated conversation called the method of real dialogue, where we have either one or two facilitators who are trained real dialogue specialists, and then they facilitate so that the two people stay within the boundaries of real dialogue, talking about their difficulties, their differences, always keeping that all humanized. So when you're in a humanized real dialogue, honestly, what has happened for everyone I've facilitated and for myself as well is that I recognize the humanity of the other person, and I don't then any longer have that desire to defeat the other person or to subdue the other person, because I realize they're interesting. They have something to say. They've had experiences. They believe what they believe because of their own lives. And in that way, I think that's the wisdom that could come from war. If we could go through a real dialogue with the other side, we would deepen that sense that we need each other, that there's no way I can figure out this world. I need others. I need others that think differently. I need others that believe differently. So, there's a whole sort of belief system that is based really on the Buddha's teachings, that hate is never transformed by hate, only by non-hate is hate transformed. And so it's really only by going through this kind of dialogue can we transform our hates and anxieties about the other side. So that's really the project I'm involved in. Looking for funding right now, looking to partner up with other groups as well, because we're teaching a skill and a method that are based on they're based on understanding human subjectivity and how Homo sapiens are attracted to enemy making and how we can break that. I do think my time with you, Eleanor, has shaped a lot of the precision, that we're now using in the Center for Real Dialogue, because you and I kind of went through the building blocks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I hope one day too that I could bring my film to the center, because I've walked, in terms of enemy making, how I went through finding the enemy within myself. And as an artist of soul, I found it was very important for me to kind of walk the charnel grounds. So because I deal so much with emotion and creating mirrors for people to take a journey, a healing journey in terms of all of this devastation and struggling with intolerance and hatred, but walking the charnel grounds, walking the Holocaust, the world wars, the Inquisition, all of these moments in history where there was so much tragedy, and actually putting my body there, because my mind couldn't understand it. I was always wrestling with all of these, these dualisms and stuff. But by putting my body there, by putting my life there, I learned something that I couldn't have learned any other way for me personally. And so this is what I work on as an artist, as someone who's dedicated her life to this, this peacemaking. Many ways now for me, prayer.
So what I'm hoping is that we can celebrate. Eventually, you can come to what we hope really be a bricks and mortar center for Real Dialogue in Vermont, and you can show your film there.
That would be great, Polly.
And it will be the final outcome of our work together.
Right. That'd be wonderful to be able to also just be in our sageness at this point in time after all of the work that we've done. And I'd also like to share, because it's part of my life where I'm involved internationally with so many individuals who are working on projects that will make, that support the sustainability of the preciousness of human life. And it gives me so much hope knowing that that's happening. And they're putting, their whole lives into it, and all of their money and their time and everything into it. So that's something that's very, very precious. And yes. A lot of good, along with all of this other, dysfunction and dis-ease and terrible tragedy that's happening in so many places on our planet right now, on all levels.
So we could say in closing, we're closing temporarily our podcast.
Yes.
We'll meet again when we can manifest the Center for Real Dialogue and the film of Eleanor, and let that be our promise that we will do that.
Yes. Thank you, Polly. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, I love you, Eleanor.
And you, Polly. It's been just so meaningful. And also, I just want to say again that I think there's so much teaching in all of the early podcasts in terms of, how we go about learning these skills and also thinking about all of this. You've laid an extraordinary foundational structure.
And we did it together. And so why don't we say just bye for now?
Yes. Okay, dear.
Like au revoir.
All right.
See you soon.
Okay.
Right.
Yes. Bye, Polly.
Bye, dear.
Thanks so much for listening. And to continue the conversation, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find past episodes of the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Castbox. Enemies from War to Wisdom is recorded and produced by Chris Coltrane.